I'm sure basically all Canadians are very thankful for our federal government to give so much support for people during this very hard time. And we're all anxious that the pandemic be over sooner rather than later. But there is growing concern that there's going to be another problem as soon as the pandemic is over, and that is, what are we going to do about the tremendous increase in government debt that is emerging as a result of all the government support. So how big is the national debt? Well, it depends on when we are asking question 4. If we go back to 1867, the national debt was 0 because the country hadn't started yet. And then over the years, governments would sometimes run deficits, spending more than they took in tax revenue. And so that meant the debt started to go up. Over the first century of the country's existence, with the little wiggles I'm not bothering to show on this graph, we got up to a national debt of $25 billion. Now that took 100 years. Then in the next half century, half the time, the debt went up by 24 times that amount, by $600 billion in just those 50 years. That gets us to only having, in the fiscal year 2021, which the government has already given its estimate for what the debt will be at the end of that, in the remaining 4 years that we have of the country's life, the debt went up by another $430 billion. And so things are really taking off. Indeed, many people, when they look at this graph, the word explosion tends to come to mind. And so I don't know where all this is ending. In the old days, of course, people who behaved like that went to debtor's prison. I hope that the entire Canadian population is not put into debtor's prison as a result of our government's efforts. And I don't believe we will. But how can we decide whether we can afford this debt? Well, when we think of an individual family, we say, well, we can't answer that question about affordability without considering the family's income. After all, a noticeable size mortgage, for instance, is no problem for a family that has a high annual income, but that same mortgage would be just unfeasible for a family that is living at, say, the poverty line. So if we're going to evaluate our national debt, we want to think of the total of all incomes earned as a result of the production activity that takes place within our borders in any year. And StatCan measures that. It's called our GDP, or gross domestic product. So that's why all analysts look at the debt to GDP ratio. Okay. So what's the history of that? Well, I won't go back quite as far. I'll start in 1929. Canada's debt ratio was 45% back then. Now, I started there because after that, we had some very hard times. We had the Great Depression for the 1930s, and then we were fighting a very serious war through the first half of the 40s. So by 1945, the next observation in my growing table here, we see that the debt ratio is way up to 110%. Now, I have never met anyone who thinks that represented bad fiscal policy on behalf of our federal government. After all, it seemed reasonable to provide support for those suffering during the 30s and to spread a little bit of the burden of the war onto future generations. When the current generation at the time was doing all the hard work, at least the future generations could share a little bit by bearing some of the financial implications. So the government was using a run-up of debt to smooth things a bit, to transfer things away from the unlucky generation toward luckier generations later. Now, what happened over the years thereafter is we worked the debt ratio down by the early 70s to 22%. Now, when I use the phrase worked it down, it sounds like we did a lot of effort to do that. To some extent we did, because remember, the debt to GDP ratio is a ratio, and we can make the numerator go down if we run budget surpluses, okay? That is where we tax more than we spend, and so that means we retire some of the debt, so the numerator in the ratio gets a little smaller. That's hard work because people like programs and they don't like taxes. But we got such a dramatic lowering in the debt ratio, mostly because the denominator behaved well. We had very rapid growth in the GDP. This was kind of lucky because that was the major reason why the debt ratio came down so dramatically. We think that it's mostly because during those years, the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, there was a major transformation of the Canadian economy, moving from primarily an agricultural-based operation to a manufacturing-based operation. And it just so happens that we were able to think of ways to increase labor productivity much more when people are producing stuff rather than food. Think of assembly lines for cars and so on. So anyway, we got the debt ratio way down. Then by 1993, it had shot up again to 68%. That's quite an increase in just 20 years. Now, I've never met anybody who thought that was good fiscal policy. There seems to be unanimous support that that was irresponsible on our federal government's part. Because after all, what was the crisis? What was the analog of the Great Depression or a war that prompted the government to say, we got to share some of these burdens with future generations? Well, nobody can come up with anything that was an analogous crisis. I think all we can say is the generation that was in control of the political process at the time, essentially your and my generation, we just decided to go on a spending spree and live beyond our means. And so that, I think, was irresponsible and not particularly nice intergenerational behavior. And the Wall Street Journal actually agreed with that view that I just expressed, because in 1993, there was a major article that essentially said, Canada deserves honorary status in the group of third world countries. Their federal fiscal house is so much in disorder. Now, the finance minister at the time was Paul Martin, and you can imagine he did not enjoy reading that article. Because after all, he's the one supposed to be in charge of the federal fiscal house. So he decided that he better embark on a very aggressive reduction in the annual deficit, which would gradually bring the debt down. Now, he was particularly interested in doing that because he, at the time, 1 out of every $3 that the federal government was collecting in taxes did not go to pay for programs for people to enjoy. That $1 went for just paying interest on the pre-existing outstanding government debt. And people don't like a government when they get taxed in a large way, only to get rather small number of programs in return. And he was particularly concerned about, because being a member of parliament from Quebec, he was very worried about Quebec separation at that time, leading up to the referendum in 2000, I think it was. And he thought the best way that he could contribute to coaxing Quebecers to not leave the country was to say, by doing so, you would lose access to a very helpful institution called the federal government. And that's what he would want them to think, but he would be sympathetic if they did not think that, if they said, I'd just as soon sever connections with an institution that taxes me so much and gives me so few programs in return. After all, a lot of the taxes are paid by relatively low-income people, and the interest payments go to the owners of the government bonds, which are on average much richer people. So the federal government was getting itself in, had got itself into a position of being a big machine that transfers income up the line instead of being concerned about inequality. So he was, he thought it was very important that he get the deficit and down to zero. So he did. He balanced the budget in fairly short order, just a few years, starting from quite a big number. But then he said, okay, I've won that battle, but now I have to decide what debt ratio should be my long-run target. And he didn't have any idea what he wanted that target number to be. And so what he did is he arranged for the Department of Finance to have a conference where about 12 academics who were known to have published on this topic and thought about it for a long time, to attend the conference and give him advice. And the condition of the invitation was that you are not to come and do like academics often do and just chat about the general issue on the one hand, on the other hand. You are to give a number. Okay. And so I was one of the 12 who were invited to come, and I was the only one of the 12 who was naive enough to think that I better take that condition of the invitation seriously. So I came with a number, but nobody else did. And so I think you can see where this is going. In any event, what I said was, it's very difficult to ask a scientist, which I like to think economists are, to decide how much intergenerational transfer you'd like to make as a government. After all, that's a value judgment. Which generation do you think is more needy than some other generation? So I said, but if you make that value judgment and tell economists what you want to do in terms of generational transfers, then we can use our expertise knowing about how to estimate and use overlapping generation models and so on. We can simulate and give you some definite advice. So just so I have a talk that at that conference was more than 2 minutes, I said, I'll take an example. I'll just assume a value judgment about intergenerations. And so what I did is I said, there is a coming crisis coming from the point of view of the late 90s when this conference was taking place. We're going to have the baby boom generation moving into retirement. And so we'll be in a situation where there's many fewer workers trying to support many more dependent people. And so that's going to mean, if there's nothing done, a decrease in the average standard of living for Canadians for a noticeable time until we all get out of the way, as it were. Now, so I said, I've used the overlapping generation methodology to estimate how much of a threat to average living standards the aging population represents. And suppose it is the case that you told me you wanted to decrease the debt enough to relieve the interest payment obligations on the government in the future, the government that will be ruling when the population is aged, by enough so that you will have improved the average living standard on the debt reduction front by just the same amount as that is needed to counteract the threat to living standards because of the aging phenomenon itself. I said, you know, I don't know whether that is what would turn you on as an objective, but I have to assume something so I can show you how we use our methodology as technical experts to combine with your values to come up with an answer to your question. So I did those calculations and presented them in the seminar and said, that tells me that you want to reduce the debt ratio to 25%. So I was shocked and even kind of scared. The very next budget that came out, there was one sentence in it that says, the government has now decided that the target debt ratio is 25% because of the aging population, full stop. And I thought anyone who just reads that sentence will wonder, my goodness, that logic has not been fleshed out too well. So I say I found it scary because I thought I was just giving an example, but apparently I was setting government policy. So, I mean, you know, sometimes I've complained over my career that I thought I gave some very good advice and it was not listened to. I guess you just can't please me because now when I do get listened to inordinately, I'm not happy with that either. But anyway. The government did work, and when the government was replaced and we had a conservative administration, they still bought into the 25% target, and we worked the debt ratio down to 30%, most of the way down to the target by 2008. And then there was the financial crisis, which caused a noticeable recession. The government stepped in and ran the annual deficit up to 50 billion. And that at the time was a staggering number. It's not staggering anymore. But that deficit did add to the debt, and so the debt ratio rose, but only by 3 percentage points. And within a very few years, it was pretty much back down to the 30%. Once we had Justin Trudeau's administration, he has not said one way or the other explicitly whether he still wishes to focus on the 25% debt target, but de facto, he said, I think we'll call 30% victory, and that's low enough. Because he continues to say, the only important thing, don't look at the size of the deficit, just say, the only important thing is that we not let the debt ratio rise above 30%. Okay, so, but now it's 50%. It's really shot up. And we haven't done with the government support, so it's going to continue to be rising. Okay, so that ends my little sort of summary of the history lesson. Now I want to move into a phase of the talk where I say, let's all pretend we're the Minister of Finance and we want to think about what we want to do about the debt after the pandemic. Well, the Minister of Finance is the person, she at this point, is the one who sets all the programs pending the programs, decides which ones and how much they're funded, and also on the other side of the ledger, figures out which taxes to rely on and how much total revenue those taxes are to collect. But since people like the programs, but they don't like paying taxes, I think most politicians, including the Minister of Finance, say, why not focus on the gap, which is the excess of the program spending over the taxes, and we can take as my objective, the pretend Minister of Finance, that I would like to maximize the gap. So anything I can do to make the gap bigger gives me more of what people want and less, relatively speaking, of what they don't want. So that's the metric I'm going to use for the next part of our talk together. I'm going to say, which way do we want to push debt to try and get the gap, so defined, to be bigger? So that's the fundamental question. The overall annual deficit is, as you know, the total spending minus total taxes collected. I could re-express that relationship a little bit by breaking up the total spending into two components. One, the spending on programs, and the other, the interest payments on the pre-existing debt. I've written the second of those two terms, in blue there, as the product of the interest rate that has to be paid on each one of those government bonds that are outstanding, times the number of those bonds that are outstanding, which is what we mean by the total debt at that point in time. Okay, then I could subtract the interest payments term from both sides, which would cause it to vanish from the left-hand side and cause it to appear with a minus sign over on the right-hand side. And why do I want to do that? Because then the left-hand side can just be relabeled the gap. So we see the gap is simply the deficit, the overall deficit minus the interest payments. So I remind you of that on the next slide, but there is a couple of other accounting relationships that we need to be cognizant of so I can fully explain to you what I think the Minister of Finance should be thinking these days. I've alluded to the fact, but just make it explicit here on the slide, that each year's deficit is that year's increase in the overall outstanding government debt. And so the debt ratio, being a ratio, if we want to get to a target and have that target stay at a fixed number, then the ratio will only stay constant in two ways. One, if neither the numerator or the denominator ever changes thereafter, or they're both changing, but they're changing at the same percentage rate. So a condition for the long run sustained being at the target is that the growth in the numerator, that's the growth in the debt, equals the growth in the denominator, that's the economy's GDP growth rate, which I will signify by the label G for growth rate in what I want to keep doing. So when you put those insights together, I've waved my arms a bit here because I know you don't want me to go through these equations anymore, but it turns out that the deficit then has to be proportional to the debt, and that factor of proportionality is the economy's growth rate. So those are the two key relationships that a finance minister needs to be aware of when deciding about debt policy. The gap is the deficit minus interest payment obligations, and the deficit is proportional to the debt. Okay, so now we're asking the question I said I wanted to address. How is the gap affected by the size of the debt? Well, there's a direct effect, which I'm trying to highlight on this slide, by having the word debt in red. The direct effect says if we can lower the debt, because the coefficient in front of debt is a minus sign there, that means the gap and the debt relate to each other inversely. So a reduction in the debt will raise the gap. So that's good news. And the simple intuition behind that, rather than just staring at the equation, is that less of the budget is needed for interest payment obligations if you don't have as much debt to pay interest on, and that leaves more room in the deficit to go toward the programs, more programs or tax cuts. So that's the direct effect, and it's good news. Future generations are better off if we bequeath to them lower debt, because then their government at that time will be able to deliver to them a bigger gap. So that's good news. But there is also an indirect effect, which I'm now highlighting in red on this slide. The debt over in the right-hand side relationship says that when the debt is lower, the deficit will have to be lower. And then the deficit is one of the determinants of the gap over on the left relationship. So lower debt means lower deficit, which means, since there's a plus sign in front of deficit in the gap relationship, that means gap has to go down. And that makes sense. The smaller is the total deficit, other things equal, the less the government will be able to provide the things we want. There'll be less room for the programs or the tax cuts. So if the only effect that was in existence was what I've just called this indirect effect, then we would see that future generations would not thank us. They would be worse off for our having bequeathed to them a smaller debt, because it would mean a smaller gap. Now, the size of each of these two competing effects is what we're interested in then. Is the good news or the bad news effect the dominant one? Well, the coefficient that connects gap to the direct effect is R, which stands for the rate of interest the government is paying on its debt. The bad news effect depends on the coefficient in the deficit to debt relationship, and that is G, which stands for the economy's GDP growth rate. So we can conclude that the debt reduction will be good news for the future generations only if the coefficient that governs the magnitude of the good news effect is bigger than the one that the bad news effect works through. In other words, only if interest rates are higher than the economy's growth rate. So we're finally getting somewhere. Let's apply that insight back to Paul Martin's time, and then what will face the Minister of Finance as soon as the pandemic is over. Back in the 1990s, the growth rate of the economy on an average annual basis was 4%. Basically 1% population growth, 1% productivity growth, and 2% inflation. Adds up to the 4%. And the general level of interest rates was much higher then, it was about 6%. So with the interest rate exceeding the growth rate, the good news effect dominated. Lower debt did help the future generations. So Paul Martin did a nice thing for the people who came after. And so there was analytical support for his entire agenda. But we don't want to just memorize that and say, well, if it was good for him, it'll be good for us after the pandemic, because things have changed. I think barring the shutdown and then the reopening and gradual recovery, all the forecasters are still looking forward after the pandemic to an annual growth rate of 4%. But now, of course, interest rates are much lower, and even 2% is a slight roundup for what's being paid on government debt today. So that means the bad news effect dominates now. And so if we go with great zeal to decrease the debt after the pandemic in the name of trying to not dump something unfortunate onto the future generations, will in fact be hurting those future generations by doing that well-intentioned maneuver. So the same analysis leads to a very different conclusion as to what would be recommended if it's those people that we're worrying about. In both cases, of course, the lower debt would mean smaller interest payment obligations. But now in the current environment, with low interest rates, this saved interest cost effect is not strong enough to dominate. And it's true that a smaller portion of the deficit will be used up in debt service if we go for debt reduction, but that deficit itself is smaller when a smaller debt target is chosen. So if that was all there was to it, if the only metric we think is sensible to use to evaluate what should we do about the debt afterwards question, the lecture would be over now. No, so let me just summarize so far before we move on there. The 1990s, debt reduction, we thought of, the common phrase was that I used in the abstract for the talk, it involved short-term pain because the generation that was doing it back in the 1990s was having to tighten their belt vis-a-vis programs given to them by the government. But there was long-term gain for the later generations. And now it's different people suffering the cost and getting the gain, but since the long-term gain was permanent and the short-term pain by definition was temporary, most people thought it was a good deal from society's overall point of view, so we embraced the short-term pain for long-term gain. But now, debt reduction will involve short-term pain and long-term pain. So I don't think that's a good deal. And so, as I say, why should we incur hardship after the pandemic, in the short run, in the name of the future generations, when in fact they won't like it? Okay, just before we move on to the next section, I just want to milk something, another important insight out of that one relationship that we've mentioned so far, which is that in the fullness of time, the deficit always has to be proportional to the debt. With that factor of proportionality being the growth rate of the economy. What that means is when a government announces its targets, it cannot just pull two independent numbers out of the air and say, here's my deficit target and here's my debt target. But that essentially is what Prime Minister Trudeau did during his first election campaign. He said, implicitly at least, we've got the debt ratio down to 30%. That's good enough for me, so I'll go forward with the debt ratio target of 0.3. But while the deficit is not zero right now, by the fourth year of my administration, I will have gotten the deficit down to zero, because that's what I want to get to, so that by the time we go to the polls again, don't worry, I will have reached my deficit target of zero. But how can, looking up at the relationship, And remember, this relationship is not an assumption. It's a fact of life. How can the product of two positive numbers give you zero? It's simply logically impossible. And so how are we to bring some consistency into the government's chosen targets? One way of doing it would be to say, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't have said deficit I'm shooting for is zero. What I'll say is I'll have a positive deficit. And in fact, I'll pick a number that's 0.04 times 0.3 times today's GDP. And if he did that, it would be about $25 billion, which was about what the deficit was when he went into his second election campaign. So I see, even though he did not make a formal announcement along the lines that I just said, he had de facto gone through that reasoning. And I wish he had said, I misspoke, I've learned something, and so why don't I use my forum to help everyone understand that? But of course, that reminds him that he broke an election promise and so on, so he doesn't do it. So a teaching moment, it was certainly lost there. There is, of course, a second way to bring consistency to a pair of targets that are announced. You could leave the target deficit at balanced budget, no deficit. And you could say, well, that means my long-run debt target is not 30%, it's zero. Okay, I don't want to have, in the fullness of time, any government debt anymore. But I just don't see, there's a lot of people who are in favor of saying you must balance the budget. They don't realize that that implies in the long run, we're doing away entirely with any government debt in the future. Why would we want to eliminate government debt? It is an institution that allows two generations, or more than that, generations that are not alive at the same point in time, to make trades with each other, because they can do it through an everlasting agent that they both have access to, which is our government. So we know that Canadians have appreciated using that institution in the past. I've reviewed that. So the people who say we've got to balance the budget simply have not answered the question, why do we want to throw away that degree of freedom in policymaking? And so you can tell I'm not particularly in favor of the balanced budget crowd. And also, I think that crowd needs to answer, if we're going to really tighten our belts to get the debt all the way down to zero, then we're going to certainly resist new government spendings and so on that are going to be needed perhaps to support retrofitting and so on. In other words, many of the initiatives that many people think are very important to address climate change, I simply won't be able to afford that because I've given precedence to this elimination of debt once and for all agenda. So it really would tie the government's hand on addressing income inequality, racial inequality, and climate change. And so I think anyone backing the balanced budget proposal would have to say why these other considerations are less important. And I think that's a challenge for those individuals. What I have been assuming is that when the government picks a high or a low target value for the debt ratio, it won't matter to the level of interest rates that obtain within the country. That was a simplifying assumption just to keep things relatively simple. But that may not be a realistic assumption, and I want to address that omission now. Well, it turns out that when a lot of these bonds that the government issues are bought by foreigners, and a lot of these foreigners don't know a whole lot about Canada. So they don't really know whether they're buying a financial asset that's risky or not. So there has developed an industry that meets that need, and this is the international bond rating agencies that advise these lenders which country is risky, which country is not, and so on. So Canada is, in some sense, at the mercy of these bond rating agencies, because if we look like we're not keeping our fiscal house in order, then we'll get a downgrade from these rating agencies. And what the rating agencies advise the lenders is that if you're going to lend to a country that we have labeled somewhat risky, then we think what that means is the government in that country will be tempted to inflate away some of the burden of the paying of the interest. So they will have liked to have borrowed dollars that bought lots of goods and services at the time, and then pay back dollars over the years that have a lower purchasing power. But if we have inflation that's the civilized way of defaulting on some of the debt, more than our trading partners, the only way that we can remain competitive is have the Canadian dollar depreciate by enough to maintain demand for our products. So if the country is risky, you can expect your wealth will suffer a capital loss because of the falling value of the currency of that country. So you better ask for and get a higher interest rate in the first place to compensate you for that risk. Now, you have heard of and heard in the news examples of this kind of problem. For instance, back in 2008, the Greek government was had a debt situation that was so out of control that they basically announced that to the world by saying, some of this debt, which is maturing at the time, we can't pay it all back. We'll just have to have you lenders take what they called, for some reason, a haircut, in which they said, we'll pay you 75 cents for each dollar we're supposed to have paid back to you. And of course, this got people very upset. And it certainly made it hard for the Greek government to issue some newly issued bonds, because now there was proof that you might not get all your principal back if you're a lender. So what happened was very, very quickly, the interest rate that used to obtain, that the Greek government used to be able to borrow money at, 5%, almost immediately went up to 35% a year. And so that really magnified their indebtedness problem. So has that kind of situation ever happened in Canada? Well, as I say, back in the 90s, the bond rating agencies got fussed, and that was summarized in that Wall Street Journal article. And so we lost our AAA standing as saying these are among the safest bonds around the world. We lost that, but apparently that wasn't enough of a signal to have any bump up in Canadian interest rates. So it looks like, just look at our own history at least, letting the debt ratio go up to orders of magnitude of 68% doesn't seem to bring a sort of higher interest rate problem. It's also noteworthy that even though the debt ratio has shot up to 50% just now, just last month, one of the major bond rating agencies said, we're happy leaving the AAA standing for Canada. So maybe too much can be made of this risk premium possibility, but I don't know. I mean, many other countries in the world that we are compared to by these rating agencies are unitary states. They only have sort of one government, but we have both the federal government and a patch of provincial governments. When you add together the provincial and government debt and look at the overall government to debt ratio, government debt to GDP ratio in Canada, it was back then and it is now essentially 100%. So I don't know why our federal government gets evaluated as if the provinces don't exist. I mean, the federal government is now helping the provinces a lot and would if they got into debt trouble in the future. So I think we're sort of skating a little bit on thin ice, because the rest of the world might wake up to the fact that we have provinces someday. But the bottom line is that while there is this concern, I wanted to leave it out in the first part of the lecture, partly because we actually don't have any clear idea what goes on in the heads of bond rating agencies, and therefore what is the magic number that would switch us over to a verdict of imprudent fiscal policy. Although we can look some places for some guidance about what might be the critical number. We can look at, for instance, what Europe's decision on this very question was back in the late 90s. At the time, there were many countries wanting to join and have subsequently joined the EU. And the existing members were concerned that they didn't want a bunch of people joining their club who had fiscal houses that were not in order. So they said to join, among other things, you have to have an annual deficit to GDP ratio no more than 3% and a debt ratio of no more than 60%. Now, those, remember I told you, these are two numbers pulled out of the air, as it were. Are they going to be consistent? Well, luckily, yes. In that back at the time with higher inflation, I think a growth rate of 5% in Europe was not a bad back of the envelope assumption. And so with that factor of proportionality, these two targets are just barely consistent with one another. But of course, that wouldn't always be the case. So I don't know why they bothered to set themselves up for some grief by having two targets that could develop for particular countries rather than the whole group at various points in the future be kind of inconsistent with one another. But let's apply Europe's rules to Canada today. If we did not do any cut in the debt ratio after the pandemic, we just said, well, it's up to 50%, but let's just leave it there. Well, that's less than 60%, so I guess we would, quote, get away with it. We would have to certainly reduce the deficit ratio because it's at 15% right now, and we'd have to get it down to something that's consistent with 4% growth and the 50% debt target, that would mean 2% of GDP, which is at today's number about $50 billion. So you can see that Prime Minister Trudeau would say, this is kind of an appealing scenario. I won't be so irresponsible as to just let the debt ratio keep going up even more than it has during the pandemic. I'll say I'm holding the line. And I am pulling down the deficit, but that still gives me a deficit that's basically double what I was getting away with before the pandemic. And we know from the throne speech that he's got lots of ambitious plans that's going to use up a lot of billions of dollars. So he might be very well tempted to do that. But it seems to me there's a bit risk there because there's little room to act as a shock absorber for the next crisis that comes along in the future, because 50% isn't much below 60% on the debt front, and 2% isn't that much below 3% on the deficit front. Now, we haven't signed into a stability pact like the countries within Europe have, but that still is a norm that bond rating agencies may think of for all Western countries. So not only would that leave us with little room to act as a shock absorber and have our federal government operate as a shock absorber in the future, there would be kind of a loss of credibility on part of Prime Minister Trudeau's part, because he would have to have shifted for several years of having saying, listen, don't worry, don't pay attention to the deficit, everything's okay. The only thing you have to look at is, are we managing to keep the debt ratio from rising above 30%? Then all of a sudden it's up to 50, and he says, don't worry, all you have to worry about is as long as we keep the the debt ratio not rising from 50%, all is well. Well, that just means he's prepared to ratchet it up and just forget what he used to say, and just every time there's a crisis, ratchet it up another notch and say, well, now that's the new thing that we're just going to let bygones be bygones and just not let it increase anymore in the future, brackets, until the next crisis. So it looks like he's basically abandoning a commitment to sort of a long-run target in that case. So I think there is a danger that we'll face the risk premium problem. Now, I said what the risk premium problem is that we would be subjected to higher interest rates in Canada than we would otherwise have. And the last thing I haven't nailed down for you is why we should fear the higher interest rates. Well, we know that firms are oriented to private profits, and so they will invest in more capital, machines, factories, various things, only if the return they get from having that capital as part of their ongoing operations exceeds the borrowing costs that they have to incur to go ahead with those investments, right? Because it's a big upfront expenditure and it's going to increase profits for a whole number of years into the future. So there is a timing problem. It means borrowing is involved. And of course, a higher interest rate means higher borrowing costs. And so that means, in the end, higher interest rates will mean fewer of those projects will be justified in a present value sense. So less capital will be in the country than would have otherwise obtained. And so the workers in our country will have less capital to work with. And the two pictures on this slide are supposed to give you a bit of intuition as to why that might be bad for workers. The picture on the left shows a farmer working with not much capital, just a simple old-fashioned plow, not being able to deal with too large a field in one day's work, whereas with more capital, like that bigger combines machine showed on the right, a single worker can deal with a very large field in one day. So the output per worker is much higher when that worker has more capital to work with. There are many rigorous empirical studies that verify that labor productivity does fall if labor doesn't have the capital to work with. And if you're not productive, you cannot command as high a wage in the marketplace. So this is bad news for people who get their income from wages and from work. So if we're caring about that subset of the population, then I think we really want to avoid getting an imprudent report card in terms of debt management. Okay, so it's interesting. We normally think of people who care about capital accumulation are people who care about capitalists, the people who own capital. Well, in the modern globalized world, don't worry about the capitalists. If the rate of return would ever fall in Canada, they'll just move their capital to the higher rates of return elsewhere. That's what globalization means, is mobile inputs to the production process can move to the best return in the world. But unskilled labor is not allowed to be mobile. They require green cards and so on to go and work in another country. So it's the very people who view themselves as spokespersons for the workers, as opposed to spokespersons for the capitalists, who should be most worried about this high interest rate development that could follow the declaration of imprudent government in terms of debt management. So what I'm saying is you don't have to be a right-winger to care about this material that I've just discussed in the last couple of slides. Indeed, the left-winger should care more than the right-winger. So what's my summary recommendation? I think then we should sort of have a balancing act. We should commit now to do something in the future when the pandemic's over. Committing now is showing to the world you care about your reputation. And what we would commit now to is a gradual and modest debt reduction in the first decade after the pandemic. I would suggest reducing it over that 10-year period by 10 percentage points. That still leaves us pulling it down from 50 to 40 and not all the way down to the 30%, even after a full decade. So I view that as modest. But I believe it's enough to avoid the bond rating agencies giving us any downgrade, which would then avoid that lower wages problem that I was just talking about a moment ago. And it would also create enough room for the government to be able to have a significant increase in debt someday in the future if another crisis comes along. So I think we get enough good news out of that so-called modest reduction. And it's small enough to limit the losses for the people in those next generations that will be imposed by the fact that we'll have bequeathed to them that smaller gap. That stuff that we talked about in the first part of the talk. So as you can see from the picture, I'm trying to balance the good news and the bad news dimensions of debt reduction. Okay. Now, why the gradual word in my recommendation? Well, it gives us time to do something else, which would be all the more appealing to do given that smaller gap problem. We would have time to pursue tax reform. The idea is, if future generations, if we can set them up so that they're relying more on taxes that economists think of as good taxes, and less on the taxes that we rely inordinately heavily on now, which we regard as bad taxes, then that shift in the tax structure would mean we could neutralize the pain that the future generations would otherwise feel because of that smaller gap we'd be giving them. So what are some examples of what we regard as good and bad taxes? That's a good question, but I'm saved by the bell. I just looked at the time and the time for the lecture is over, so I don't get to answer that question. I would have liked to provide some answer to that question, and so if there's time in the question and answer session, I will come back to that. Hint, hint, does somebody want to ask me that question? But anyway, that ends the formal part of the talk, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, a few questions here. First one, presuming Biden wins the US election, what might the effect of his stated policies be on Canadian interest rates and trade policies?
Well, on trade policies, the Democratic Party has always been known as the party, in history at least, the party that's more leery of free trade deals, because a number of people who are among their supporters are people who think that trade ruins domestic employment. But I think now they realize that no, it doesn't. It just causes the US to shift more into jobs where they have a comparative advantage and can export, and they might as well take advantage of getting goods that they're not so good at producing via imports instead. So as long as when you're embracing free trade as a nation, you help those who are transitionally hurt to move into the expanding sectors and out of the contracting sectors, then it's a shame to throw away a permanent annual benefit just because you want to avoid some one-time costs. So I think the Democratic Party has gradually come around to the view that, yeah, rather than resist free trade, you should embrace it, but assuming you've got those adjustment assistance policies in place. So, and also, there seems to be kind of a switch on the other side. It used to be that the Republicans say, we care about long-run living standards, never mind short-term disruptions. We're the free trade party. Which party is more embracing of free trade seems to have completely switched over. So while I think I'm overstating the dramaticness and the completeness of that shift over, I think it's true that a Biden administration would not undo whatever the new label of NAFTA 2 really is. While Trump called it a victory, he's replaced a horrible trade deal with a good one, the best one ever. It's in fact almost the same. So I think we won't get any serious change on that front either. Yeah, he has said that he would reverse some of Trump's tax cuts on corporations. Okay, now that will mean that corporations won't, the owners of capital who are deciding which country they want their capital employed within, they won't be as tempted as they were before to keep it in the States. So they'll be more willing, other things equal, to bring it into Canada. So that's a good news development. We get more capital for our workers without having to cut our corporate tax. We just get we're a beneficiary on the side of them having to crank up their corporate tax. That's the inverse of what happened when Trump pulled those corporate tax rates in the US down. That made it harder to keep capital here. So our government responded by cutting the corporate taxes here, and they thought they had no option. Otherwise, we'd get this lower wages problem. But now we don't face that problem. So we could afford, if we need some more revenue, to increase our corporate taxes back up again a bit. And without the fear that we would scare the capital away, as long as we put back up our corporate taxes by less than Biden is expected to down there. So I don't think there's a fear on the trade front, and we've got a new degree of freedom on the major tax change front. So I would not fear a Biden administration for that reason.
Hey, there's a few questions here about giving examples of good and bad taxes.
The idea is that when the government, I mean, people make decisions all the time in a capitalistic economy. Say the decision to whether, do I want to go out and have a job in the marketplace? Or do I want to stay home and be a caregiver for an aging parent or for some young children, whatever. You want people to make those decisions on the basis of what matters to them in terms of how they rank these competing uses of their time. You don't want the government to come in and say, I would like to meddle with that decision. I would like to impose incentives on you that steer you one way or the other. Economists take the view that the government shouldn't be paternalistic. You should let people, they know what's best for them, and so you don't want to needlessly affect private decision-making. So when you do things like having income taxes, which make it less desirable to go out in the market to earn, then you're affecting that, what should be a private decision. So we say the government taxation is a bad tax because it's distorting decisions that we have no business distorting when our only real goal is to get some revenue for the government. On the other hand, there's some private sector decisions which people take, which we do want to distort. Think of, for instance, a company that is dumping some waste from its manufacturing operations out into a river nearby. And there's people down the river who want to drink it and swim in it. We call that a negative externality. The government, sorry, the firm, there's no institutional mechanism for them to have to pay for that, so they do it. And they do it more than is in society's best interest because the price they face is wrong. There is a cost to the rest of society, but they are operating as if there's a zero price. So the government does want to affect decisions like that when there are third-party effects that we call negative externalities. And there's quite a few of those things around, secondhand smoke, etc. So that's a situation where we would like to raise the price above zero of doing those things. And that's the rationale, say, for a carbon tax. And pollution levies in general. So I think we should essentially tax activities that we don't like, brackets, ones that are leaving the decisions made by private actors distorted in a way that we don't like. Let's try and remove those distortions through the use of the tax system. But then where there's other areas where we cannot identify any negative externality, then leave well enough alone. Don't distort those decisions. So that means, for instance, in the example I've used, cutting down our reliance on the major revenue raiser, which is personal income taxes, and increasing our reliance on pollution taxes, carbon taxes, that sort of thing. Having congestion levies for the use of throughways at heavy use times and so on. So that's what we mean by, we have to assess whether the tax is needed to ameliorate an existing distortion or whether it's just going to create a distortion when there was none there in the first place. That's the overriding principle. Just if I could have just another moment, one of the reasons I think there's so many externalities going on out there is when we look at the self-reported happiness surveys that have been going on for 70 years now, in countries like Canada, the average Canadian is no more happy today than they are, well, this was before the pandemic, no more happy today than they reported they were in 1950, even though GDP per person has gone up by orders of magnitude. Well, they got way more stuff and yet they're not any happier. Why can that be? And what we think we understand there is that the thing that people are increasingly spending on in rich countries are what economists call positional goods. They really just make you feel good, not because the bigger house gives you necessary housing services more than the smaller house. It's that you have a feeling of having kept up with the Joneses and that you're, relatively speaking, doing okay in this world. And so if everybody moves to something that's only justified so that you're doing better than others, but everybody's doing that, then nobody's getting to be better than others. And so it's all extra spending, which is not creating extra happiness. So, in other words, since we in developed economies spend so much on positional goods, and because positional goods impose negative externalities, my bigger house makes me happy, but it makes the guy down the road feel less happy. And we want to once again limit those negative externalities. What we want then is more reliance on expenditure or sales taxes. But we want to rig it in such a way, since most of that positional consumption is done at the high end, we want to rig it in a way so it's a progressive expenditure tax.
Oh, I think we have time for one more question. Paul Martin took your advice earlier. Who is providing expert advice to Christina Freeland now?
I think there's some sort of, they always call them blue ribbon committees or whatever. In terms of the one that, if there is one now and created by Minister Frieda, I didn't get invited this time, so I don't know who's involved there. With the C.D. Howe Institute, which I, as Tony mentioned at the start, I've been associated with as a vehicle to get heard more. They put together about 3 weeks ago a group called the Tax and Debt Working Group, and they've invited about 20 people to be involved in that, and I've got an unconditional invitation there. I didn't have to promise a number or anything beforehand. And so we meet virtually and had one yesterday afternoon, for instance. And so the C.D. Howe puts out the communiques after these meetings, giving unguarded advice about what they would do if they were Minister of Finance. So I don't know who else is advising them, but I'm still having a bit of a chance to tell them what we think. And